HIV and AIDS started in the Democratic Republic of Congo around 1920. Up until the 1980s, HIV and AIDS spread it into 5 continents: North America, South America, Europe, Africa, and Australia. In this period, between 100,000 and 300,000 people could have already been infected. In 1981, cases of rare lung infections called pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, also known as PCP, were found in 5 young, previously healthy gay men in Los Angeles. At the same time, there were reports of a group of men in New York and California with an unusually aggressive cancer named Kaposi sarcoma. In 1981, the first cases of PCP were reported in people who inject drugs. By the end of the year, there were 270 reported cases of severe immune deficiency among gay men. 121 of them had died. Around January of 1983, AIDS was reported among the female partners of men who had the disease, suggesting it could be passed on by heterosexual sex. Around June of 1990, International AIDS Conference in San Francisco protested against the USA's immigration policy, which stopped people with HIV from entering the country. But also, in November 7th of 1991, professional basketball player Irving Magic Johnson announced he had HIV and retired from the sport. This announcement helped begin to dispel the stereotype that HIV was a gay disease. Another celebrity, also one of our favorites, Eric Glenn Wright, also known as Eazy-E, was diagnosed with HIV/AIDS virus. 1 month after his diagnosis, he died on the month of March 26, 1995. Around the year of 2000, they announced that AIDS was the fourth biggest cause of death worldwide and #1 killer in Africa. An estimated 33 million people were living with HIV, and 14 million people had died from AIDS since the start of the epidemic. The same year, the United Nations adopted the Millennium Development Goals, which included a specific goal to reverse the spread of HIV and other diseases.
But before, when people try to help people with AIDS or HIV, they were usually under a lot of discrimination. This meant that they usually had a lot of problems. But people that were usually subjugated to having HIV or AIDS were usually gay men or bi men. Also, if you were Black or Latino, you had a higher rate than most people for having HIV or AIDS. This was not the only reason. If you were in poverty, you had a 1% more chance of having AIDS or HIV. This led the government to see the wrongs, and in 2019, they donated $34 billion. $28 billion was for domestic HIV efforts. So the funds to help the domestic epidemic that was going on, but also $21.5 billion also too was for care. And even though the government donated money to people with AIDS and HIV, this not meant that people that disliked people with AIDS or HIV don't dislike them no more. Now there's still the epidemic still going on. There's still people doing moves or walks for people with AIDS or HIV, and there's still people that go against them, and they just want to discriminate them. This does not mean anything. It doesn't mean anything because it's been going on since 1970, and now people don't care if you have AIDS or HIV as much as before, and now they're trying to help them by giving them more opportunities for medical care and more opportunities to have a lesser chance of having AIDS or HIV. This meaning that we are past the time of people caring so much about you having AIDS or HIV. We just want the best for most people in the time we are in, and this is how it should be. But like before and today, there are still a lot of people that are against AIDS and HIV because mainly it's from homosexuality, and a lot of Christian leaders are against it. And back in like March 22, 1980, a year before the first MMWR report, Christian leaders delivered a petition to President Jimmy Carter for them to demand a halt of gay rights in advance of it. And it says, God's judgment is going to fall on America as in other societies that allowed homosexuality to become a protected way of life. And that's what Bob Jones III predicted. After this speech, there was an anti-gay reaction, and this came across America, especially with the election of moral majority allied Ronald Reagan. And activists found themselves demanding for attention for the growing medical crisis that was getting ignored. And in March for LGBTQ civil rights ground to a halt, and because of a dozen states repealed sodomy bans in 1970s, and just two jurisdictions, Wisconsin and Virgin Islands, decriminalized sodomy in the 1980s. And to add, they called the virus HIV or AIDS a gay plague, and people used to laugh at that, and then they used to make jokes about HIV or AIDS. But in like 1984, a Health and Human Service Secretary, Margaret Heckler, said that she found a vaccine for AIDS, and they tested, but the vaccine would be available in 1986, but the vaccine never came. And even after all these things that were said about HIV and AIDS, it took President Reagan to publicly utter the words AIDS until 1985 when he did, when like 12,000 Americans had already died to the virus, and that it was swiftly going through the populations, and injection drug users were getting the best of it. But in 1987, they have found their first drug and it was approved to treat AIDS, but it did not treat AIDS. It only just slowed down the disease, and it did not cure or prevent death. It just slowed it down. And so for the drug to work, they gave the patients AZT pills, which was the drug, to take every 4 hours, night and day, forever. And by today's standards, that much AZT is a toxic overdose. And to face the government's silence after all these things they have said, a group formed, and they're now the oldest organization in the world for AIDS or HIV, and it was founded in New York City in 1982. The name for this group was called the Gay Men's Health Crisis. And along with the Gay Men's Health Crisis, activists were still frustrated at the government for they not doing anything while so many bodies were piling up of the disease. And so now today there's a lot of people or activists that draw art that are legendary and that help the process of the government's response to become faster. And this allows quicker testings and treatment of life-saving experimental drugs. And now after all these things people have tried to do, we are in a time that we are acting better and just better for people with AIDS and HIV. And now we're in a better time, and this can be better, but we're at our best and highest peak of helping people with AIDS and HIV. and it's only going to get better. And this was the whole American AIDS/HIV crisis that I have covered.